Joining me now is Judge Jim Gray. He is now retired, and he's a vocal opponent of the war on drugs. How are you doing, Your Honor?
I'm just doing great, thank you, and it's nice to be with you.
What is your history as a judge, attorney, and prosecutor, and how have your experiences led you to become one of the most vocal critics of the war on drugs?
Well, I'm a former so-called drug warrior. I was in the Navy JAG for a while. I drew up the charge sheets for my fellow shipmates, numbers of which I was also, of course, a criminal defense attorney in the Navy. After that, I was a federal prosecutor in Los Angeles, and the United States Attorney's Office actually held the record for the largest drug prosecution in the Central District of California back in 1978, which was 75 kilos of heroin, 165 pounds was and is a whole bunch of heroin. Today, the record is about 18 tons of cocaine in one place. And then just appointed as a judge beginning at the end of 1983, where you just watch in your own courtroom and see us churning low-level drug offenders through the system for no particularly good purpose, costing a lot of money along the way, seeing us arrest, convict, and incarcerate even big-time drug dealers in various cities. Does that mean that now heroin or cocaine or marijuana is no longer available in that city? And of course not. It takes about an hour and a half to replace that person. So it's just become really apparent to me that what we're doing was not working. So I held a press conference, a very unusual thing to do for a sitting trial court judge back in April of 1992, and said the truth, which is what we're doing isn't working. There must be a better way. Let's put our heads together and come up with something better. And I also guaranteed the world, or anyone who would listen, that by the year 2000 we would have a materially different drug policy in our country, because it was so apparent that what we were doing wasn't working. And I obviously was wrong on that, but it's clear that we will change our policy. To what and when, I can't tell you, but what we're doing couldn't be worse if we tried.
You have ranked the war on drugs as one of the worst public policy failures in American history, second only to the policy of slavery. What is the history of racial discrimination in the war on drugs, even as far as the rhetoric used in the early 1900s that led up to drug prohibition?
Well, you do not have to be a sociologist to go through any jail or prison in our country to see that people of color are vastly overrepresented, particularly when all of the studies show that anyone that uses drugs, it's pretty much level across all socioeconomic, racial, or whatever reasons. If any group uses drugs any more than mine, it's basically mine, that is upper middle class Caucasian males. Mm-hmm. But it's clear that not only do we lead the world in the putting of people in prison in our countries, both by sheer numbers as well as per capita, but it is totally racially imbalanced, and that is not what our country stands for. And that does give rise to all kinds of conspiracy theories. So the whole thing is racist, to all the rest of that. Honestly, I've written a book on this called Why Our Drug Laws Have Failed and What We Can Do About It, a judicial indictment of the war on drugs. And in that I have a chapter on the history of the policies and laws of drug prohibition. They do have their rates in racism. With regard to cocaine, it was to get those blacks from harming our white females. With regard to opium dens, of course, it was those Chinese. Certainly with regard to the marijuana, it was those Mexicans who were going to get drug crazed and attack our white women. And that is basically taken from the congressional record. I don't think it's intended to be that way. I certainly don't think it's intended to be enforced that way. But as a practical matter, it is, and it's a terrible thing to see. It is not what my country stands for, and we must change it.
What civil liberties infringements occur as a result of police tactics in the war on drugs, such as civil asset forfeiture and SWAT teams being used to deliver search warrants on nonviolent homes?
Well, the problem is that everybody pretty much sees what we're doing isn't working. And not only you can ask a Rotary Club or religious group or anything else like I do, but the politicians realize it, the courts realize it, etc. So we're taking ever more radical measures to make the square peg fit into the round hole. And that means, and again, in my book, Why Our Drug Laws Have Failed, we have a chapter on the erosion of civil liberties. I cite, using only United States Supreme Court drug-related cases, how our protections under the Fourth Amendment for search and seizure, or First Amendment for freedom of expression, religion, the Fifth Amendment on takings, etc., are being eroded because of the war on drugs. And that isn't even beginning to talk about this whole asset forfeiture thing, because that has turned our system of justice on its head. Now it is required that anyone whose property has been forfeited has to take the initiative to bring it back, and they have the burden of proof of showing it was not drug-related, etc. We have people in the United States Supreme Court sanctioned this. They were grandparents in Oakland living in government-sponsored housing, and they took in their grandson, who was in his teens, and unbeknownst to the grandparents, as the judge said, the grandson was off selling marijuana a couple of blocks away, and they decided that that was enough to evict the grandparents from their federally sponsored housing because of their grandson's activity. And the trial court judge said, you know, your only mistake was you were too nice in bringing in your grandson. It's just an abomination. People around the world, in the European Union, any of the rest, they look at us in horror that we could have so many people in prison. We have the most radical policy of drug prohibition in our country, really, than any other Western democracy or Western country, and we have a worse drug problem than any other Western country. I'm convinced that there's a relationship there.
And there's the relationship between drug prohibition and violence. How has the war on drugs created all the gang violence and organized crime, trapping our nation's youth in a system that could be easily eradicated if our politicians didn't think they have jurisdiction over what you and I put into our own bodies?
Well, and what you say is correct. And basically, we have two choices. We can either have these drugs in our society with Mexican drug cartels and juvenile gangs and other thugs, or without them. That no civilization has ever had freedom from some form of mind-altering, sometimes addicting substances, except maybe the Eskimos, because they couldn't grow anything, but now chemistry has changed that as well. So the drugs are here to stay. And the problem is then we're facing two harms. One is the harms because of the drugs themselves, and I'm not minimizing them. Methamphetamines scare me to death. The other problems, too, although many of those problems are caused by the unknown quality of the drugs. People have no idea what they're actually putting into their bodies. That we can address and should. But the second problem is drug money harms, and those are the ones you're touching on here, because the violence in Mexico is the easiest thing to point at. It has nothing to do with drugs. They have lost 50,000 people due to drug violence or killings because of drug money. It has anything to do with drugs. It's drug money that is killing these people. And our juvenile gangs here, pretty much everyone nationwide is using the drug money as a recruiting tool, telling our children, hey, come join us and be part of the action. Most of the funding for all juvenile gangs comes from the sale of illegal drugs. I was on juvenile court. You see that day in and day out. It's a bad thing to have happen. And today you do not have high school kids selling Jim Beam bourbon to each other in their high school campuses, but they're selling illegal drugs all the time. And finally, you do not see today Mexican drug cartels raising illegal vineyards in our national forests in competition with Robert Mondavi. But, of course, they would if there was any money in it, but there isn't. But they're raising marijuana and worse all the time. So these are things that we simply must bring under control. And finally, and I know I'm going on here, but there's just so much to talk about. People have other questions. I have a website. It's judgejimgray.com. Gray is Gray, so it's judgejimgray.com. But there's just so much to talk about that we just have to open our eyes and legitimize the discussion. And once we do that and allow ourselves to discuss this matter openly, I guarantee that we will repeal drug prohibition because of its failures. And I further guarantee that a minimum of 2 or 3 years after that, everybody in the country will look back and be aghast that we could have perpetuated such a failed system for so long.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, as you said, prohibition doesn't make the drugs disappear from society. They are merely shifted from the above-ground market regulated by entrepreneurs and the conscious choices of consumers to the black market, which is unregulated by the forces of market competition due to the illegality of the product. What would you give a free market argument to conservatives who are skeptical of repealing drug prohibition?
Well, sure, and you're absolutely right. We have, under Prop 215 here in California, the medical marijuana approach. And so you have cities like Los Angeles. Well, okay, they put in a system for people to come in with medical marijuana dispensaries and then turn their backs for 2 or 3 years, and then we're horrified that there are people out there that are taking advantage of the system. Well, of course, some people will do that, and if they're not keeping the law of the state of California, they should be prosecuted. But now California, Los Angeles, has gone wholesale and tried to close down these medical marijuana dispensaries. Well, okay, you can do that because you know where they are. They advertise with these little green signs. But it did not result in less marijuana being sold or used in Los Angeles. It just pushed it underground again. And so you have the same thing without people paying the sales taxes and paying the FICA and their income taxes and all the rest. And then the quality control is gone. You know, free market people, you have to understand that the biggest oxymoron of our lives today is the term controlled substances. You know, we have the Controlled Substances Act. We make things illegal. We prohibit them. No, biggest oxymoron of our day, because as soon as you prohibit something, you give up all of your ability to control it whatsoever. You give up all of these issues to the bad guys, like, you know, place of sale and quantity and quality and age restrictions and licensing and advertising. All of those are now controlled by Mexican drug cartels, juvenile gangs, and, you know, people like the Hells Angels. We couldn't do it worse if we tried. So let's regulate it and control it, bring it under the law, control the quality. You know, I myself, as a sitting judge, sentenced on several occasions, usually young men, for being under the influence of methamphetamines. And they tell me at time of sentencing, and everybody knew what the sentence was going to be, because under Section 11550 of the Health and Safety Code, it was a mandatory minimum of 90 days in jail. I couldn't give them less, and I certainly wasn't going to give them more. So, but they would say at time of sentencing, Your Honor, my drug of choice is marijuana. And for years, I've been buying my marijuana from a particular guy. Okay, one fine day, he sold me some marijuana laced with methamphetamines. I didn't know it. I smoked it a few times and got myself hooked. I kept thinking to myself, even back then, my goodness, that's an issue that we can address. The FDA has addressed that long ago, that for all that smoking cigarettes is not a healthy thing to do, and I hope nobody does it, but at least if you go to your local 7-Eleven and buy a pack of Marlboros, you know it's not going to be laced with methamphetamines. Those are issues that really should and must be resolved. But we give up all of those things today to the bad guys. And, of course, we have an initiative we're trying to put on the ballot now in California called Regulate Marijuana Like Wine. And people have questions about it. Go to the website, regulatemarijuanalikewine.com. And what does it say? According to the Attorney General, this isn't my language, that's the Attorney General's summary, that if we do this and control it and regulate it just like wine, we'll potentially save tens of millions of dollars each year in California alone in enforcement costs, and generate potentially hundreds of millions of dollars each year in revenues. Well, wait a minute. You know, would you rather have these hundreds of millions of dollars going to juvenile gangs and Mexican drug cartels, or being used to fix our highways, pay our firefighters, and educate our children? And by the way, you'll make marijuana less available for children under that system than it is today. Why? Because today the illegal marijuana dealers do not ask for ID. You know, what's going on here? What's not to like? Let's do this. Mm-hmm. That does not mean we condone using marijuana any more than we condone, drinking a martini after work or drinking or smoking cigarettes, because they're not illegal for adults. It's the same thing here. Regulate it and control it, because prohibition never works as well as regulation and control.
Mm-hmm. And there were studies that showed street marijuana versus dispensary marijuana, that the quality and the amount of pesticides or molds were more in the street ones than in the dispensary ones, because they have an incentive to keep their customers. But what is your involvement with Regulate Marijuana Like Wine? And since the window for gathering signatures is drawing near, what should our listeners know about how to help in these final days, and explain the recent unity of the other two legalization initiatives, and how our listeners can help with the cause beyond the signature deadline for Like Wine?
Yes, we are close to the date for Regulate Marijuana Like Wine. I support any of the other initiatives. I think they support ours. Some of them have a later date for their signatures to be due. I have signed their initiatives. I think they have signed ours. We need to join our forces, and if for some reason we're not able to get one of these initiatives on the ballot, because if we do, it will pass. We had a poll that showed that if you call it the legalization of marijuana, we still got 56% of the high-propensity voters. And if you told the truth, which is it's regulate and control, it was somewhere between 59 and 62%. So people are ready for this. They're beginning to understand for all kinds of the reasons that we've been talking about. If for some reason we do not get one of these initiatives on the ballot, I know we're going to all join forces for 2014 and come up with one that will be combined, I hope, to take the best parts of all of them and join forces and get this one on the ballot. Unfortunately, that would be another 2 years of sorrow and pain that we're inflicting on ourselves, but it's the best we can do.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think Governor Gary Johnson is the most qualified candidate for president, not only by his consistent rhetoric, especially on this issue, but by actually following his rhetoric into action?
Well, you've been doing your homework, haven't you? I do believe that. I am a libertarian, and I have been since actually I was a lifelong Republican until the passage of the so-called Patriot Act, which is a direct frontal assault on our civil liberties, and I couldn't be a part of any organization that would condone that. Gary Johnson actually, while he was a two-term Republican sitting governor in New Mexico, was speaking publicly about the harms of drug prohibition. He actually was one of those that endorsed my book, which makes him brilliant in my mind, along with, by the way, George Shultz, who was the Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan, and Walter Cronkite, whom we all know, or Milton Friedman is a hero of mine. But Gary Johnson understands forces. He understands what works. He went into New Mexico as a Republican in a Democratic state, audited, seeing what's working and what isn't. He left the state with $1 billion surplus, and he worked well with Democrats because, you know, it's a nonpartisan issue. Let's put in issues, matters, programs that work, get rid of the ones that don't. And now he is running for president as a libertarian. I support him openly, and the more people see what he stands for and how he would help our country, which is definitely in need, they will support him as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for stopping by the show. What's your website again and the title of your book?
Well, and thank you. The website is judgejimgray.com. Gray is Gray, and there's a lot of information there. In fact, you can sing some of my songs. I've written a musical for high schools called Americans All, and I'm proud of it. It was performed recently by Vanguard University. So you can see some of my songs on my website, judgejimgray.com. And the book is called Why Our Drug Laws Have Failed and What We Can Do About It, a judicial indictment of the war on drugs. It's the second edition was just out on the streets about 2 or 3 months ago, so it's been updated. I'm proud of it, and we're all going to get together and repeal drug prohibition for just a multitude of reasons. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss it with you and your listeners.
Thank you very much. And for those listening, regulatemarijuanalikewine.com, and locally in San Diego, the headquarters for that is at Cafe Libertalia in Hillcrest. It is 3834 5th Avenue in San Diego in Hillcrest. So thank you very much for stopping by the show, Your Honor.
Good luck to us all. Talk to you soon.
You too. Bye.